A medic who was dispatched to an older woman's house to help her receives the shock of his life when he sees portraits of himself as a child hanging on her walls. Leo Monti's life as a paramedic was dedicated to helping others. He took great pride in his work, but he could never have imagined that it would lead him to solve the greatest mystery of his life, his mother's demise. His father, Fred Monti, had told him about his mother's death when Leo was just 2 years old. According to Fred, her car had ended up in a ditch after swerving out of control on a rainy day with low visibility. Help had arrived too late because the woman passed away before they could transport her to the hospital. It was precisely what made the young boy vow to himself to dedicate his life to helping people, and so he studied and became a paramedic, an absolute guru in the field. It was not an easy job, especially because Leo had to meet people at the worst points in their lives. Some he met were broken, and others were suffering, but knowing his actions helped make it all worth it. One sunny noon, Leo and his partner Ezra got an emergency call from a dispatcher. They were to get to the suburbs and fast. A child had called the police to tell them his grandmother had fallen and couldn't get up. "That's tragic," said Ezra. "Another slip and fall. Hopefully, the woman is not too badly hurt." "Yeah," said Leo. "I can't imagine what that poor kid must be facing all alone," yet he was able to call 911. Ezra turned on the siren without another word, and they sped towards the address following a route prescribed by their onboard GPS. They made good time. In 10 minutes, the two arrived at the location, a lovely red brick house with a well-tended garden. There was no time to admire the aesthetics of the house, and as soon as they stopped the engine, they got to business. "Are you the police?" a voice asked after they rapped on the door several times. Leo answered, "No, we're the paramedics. We brought an ambulance to help your grandmother." After a brief pause, the sound of the door unlocking was heard, and a boy who couldn't have been older than 5 opened the door. "Please," he said, "you have to help her." "That's why we're here," Ezra said gently. "What's your name, pal?" "I'm Bill. My grandmother's name is Mrs. Garrett," he said seriously. "She's in the living room right now. Please help." Ezra and Leo followed the little boy through the lovely house and into an elegant living room. The woman in question lay flat on her back in the middle of the floor and was deadly pale. Leo quickly crouched down on his knees next to the prone woman and started to check her vitals while Ezra examined her for any injuries. Her pupils responded to light normally, which encouraged Leo to ask her if she could tell them what happened. Mrs. Garrett nodded slowly and whispered, "I had been standing on the chair to change a faulty bulb. I slipped when I reached for it, and my leg, I think it's broken." "Ma'am," Ezra said, "you don't seem to have any life-threatening injuries, but we still need to get you to the hospital for some checkups." "No, wait," cried Mrs. Garrett. "Please, you have to call my daughter. My grandson can't stay home alone. I have an address book in the hallway, and it has her number. It's the one right on top." Ezra left to get the phone number they could call to reach Eric's mom, while Leo prepared the older woman for transportation. He had just finished doing that when he looked up and saw something familiar. It was a photo of a woman posing next to a toddler. A photograph he knew very well because it was the last photo he took with his mother. He cherished it. How had the picture ended up in the older lady's house? Then he heard Mrs. Garrett moan in pain, and Leo decided he would have to leave the questions for later. On their way to the hospital, Leo held Mrs. Garrett's hand, and his eyes almost never strayed from her face. She didn't look anything like the lady in the photo, but they seemed to have the same coloring. And then there were the eyes. At the hospital, doctors found out that the fall had broken her leg in 3 places and she would need surgery. So Leo decided he would have to return after a few days and find out who the woman was. Perhaps she was a relative, some distant cousin he was not aware of. His dad said that he had lost touch with his mother's family after moving away from Florida. 3 days later, the devoted paramedic visited Mrs. Garrett holding a big bouquet of flowers. She was sitting up in bed, and color had returned to her skin. She smiled when she saw Leo, and the smile teased a bell in his memory. "Hello," the woman said brightly. "What a pleasant surprise. Are those flowers? I love flowers. Do you make it a habit to bring people you rescue flowers?" Leo was not in the mood for a bant, so he answered with a silent and severe no. The woman picked up on his seriousness and waited for him to continue. "I'm here because I wanted to ask you about a photo I saw in your house. It was a picture of a little boy and his mom." At that, The woman sat up straight, and her lips thinned. "That's a private matter. Please leave." Leo had no plans to listen. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. You see, the kid in the photo was me, and that woman was my mother. The shot was taken days before she passed, and I simply wish to know why you have it." Mrs. Garrett had gone pale again. "Your mom," she whispered. "A picture of your mom?" "Yes," Leo said. "I believe I have the right to know who you are and how you came to have the photo." Mrs. Garrett started trembling, and her eyes glistened with tears. "Leonard?" she whispered. "Is that really you?" Leo felt like he had been hit with a sledgehammer. "You know my name? How do you know me?" "Oh, Pumpkin, it's me. It's Mommy," Mrs. Garrett cried and stretched out her arms. "No, it can't be," Leo said, backing away. "She died 23 years ago. Father," he started to say, but suddenly turned his back on Mrs. Garrett and rushed out of the room, ignoring her calls. Later that night, he visited his dad, who opened the door with a cheerful smile. "Hey there, son," the man said. "This is a pleasant surprise." Leo didn't have time for small talk. "Dad, why did you lie to me that Mom was dead?" The man's jaw dropped open at the question, and a blank look fell over his face. "Your mom, she's dead." "No, Dad," Leo said. "She's not, and I know this because I've met her. In fact, I saw her today. She's alive, and she even knew my name. Why did you tell me she was dead?" Fred knew the ruse was up as soon as he heard Leo's statement, so he decided to come clean. "She was going to leave me, Leo. She wanted to take you away." He lifted his head, and his eyes looked cold. "I just beat her to the punch. You made me mourn her death. I was just 2. Leo lashed out. He saw Fred try to make up those excuses to defend himself, but he wasn't about to listen, so he turned his back and walked away. That same day, Leo found himself by old Mrs. Garrett's bed once more. "He told me you had passed away," he said, his throat constricted with emotions. "I cried so much, you have no idea." The woman spread her arms wide again, and Leo quickly stepped into her embrace. "I was inconsolable at first too," Mrs. Garrett whispered. "I never gave up on looking for you. Even when I remarried and had your sister, thoughts of you never left my mind." Mother and son spent the whole night catching up, and Leo never left her side again.